Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Sunday Sessions live from our Facebook pages. My name is James Peters, stepping in as guest host for another week, and I'm also joined here today with my other guest host, Luke Stewart. Good afternoon, Luke.
Hey, how you going?
Great. The ABC. It has been an area of strong and growing contention in recent years, with fears of a political bias to left-wing politics, unwavering amounts of political correctness, controversial comments and reports made about the government, yet minimal criticism of any opposition. Has the ABC gone too far from being an honest public broadcaster? Is defunding the ABC the only solution? Joining us today to discuss this matter is Evan Mulholland. Evan is the Director of Communications at the Institute of Public Affairs. A fierce advocate for freedom and democracy, Evan has been a strong supporter of reform for the ABC through his work at the IPA and writings throughout Australian media. Thank you for joining us today, Evan.
Thanks for having me. I'm a big follower of your Facebook page and your Sunday sessions, and also good on you for the work you do as a Liberal Club fighting for freedom on campus and VSU and everything else. As a former Liberal Club president down here in Victoria at La Trobe and a former ALSF president almost 10 years ago now, showing my age, I definitely value and appreciate all the work you guys do.
Thank you very much, Evan. We really appreciate it. Now, to everyone watching live, you can always post your questions to Evan in the comments, and we'll try to get to as many of those throughout the show. Now, Evan, firstly, were you ever a fan of the ABC? And if so, what was the moment that made you change your mind about them?
I wouldn't so much say fan as a consumer of the ABC. For a political animal like myself, you kind of need to be. And there was a time in, say, about 5, even 10 years ago, where the ABC had a lot of agenda-setting programs. You wouldn't miss the 7:45 news. You wouldn't miss AM or RN breakfast if you wanted to know what was going to be the big stories of the day. You wouldn't miss an episode of Q&A on a Monday night because that would set the tone for the rest of the week in politics. But increasingly, we've seen at the ABC an aura of impartiality be swallowed up by green left activism. And I think that kind of started with in the ABC with the Zaki Mallah incident, where they invited a convicted criminal and terrorist sympathiser on to berate an Abbott government minister, and lots of other examples of bias along the way. They used to have a lot of shows that were quite funny, say The Chaser or some of the Chris Lilly shows that they just wouldn't dare to air these days because political correctness has taken over the national broadcaster, and also just this obsession with activism, whether it be on climate change and social justice issues that seem to dominate the news headlines. And I think the editorial bias and the selection of stories as well gets in the way of what's actually news. And so I think that's reflected in the public's view of the ABC, and increasingly it's seen as a partisan broadcaster. This past year especially, we've seen multiple examples, whether it be targeting coalition cabinet ministers to looking into the friend of Scott Morrison's wife's husband's QAnon links. There's nothing the ABC won't go to for a bit of a political hit, and that's really come at the expense of its reputation as a public broadcaster.
On the topic of political implications, do you think that there's animosity towards people who criticise or suggest that there may be bias involved with the ABC?
Absolutely. The ABC goes after its perceived enemies, one of them being the coalition government at the moment. And you only have to look at the extraordinary way in which the ABC responded to a very narrow Senate inquiry looking into its complaints handling process to see how it does not like scrutiny. A taxpayer-funded independent broadcaster demanded the Senate to terminate an inquiry looking into itself so it could avoid scrutiny. That is an outrageous thing for a taxpayer-funded institution to do. You can only imagine if it was a Labor government and the Australian Tax Office, came out and demanded the Senate vote in a particular way. It is an outrageous breach of faith by the ABC, and it shows the lengths they're willing to go to avoid scrutiny. And I think, the complaints handling process especially has left a lot to be desired. We saw whether it be its Juanita Nelson documentary, its Ghost Fire documentary, its Heard a Pop allegations into war crimes that Heston Russell and a lot of veterans are up in arms about. A lot of complaints aren't being dealt with properly by the ABC, and their complaints process is done in a way which avoids all scrutiny. They say it's all separate teams handling the complaints within the ABC. If that's the case, why not adopt a model like the SBS, which refers everything to a separate ombudsman? If you're going to say you're the most trusted, why wouldn't you trust that process with someone outside of the ABC? But as we see with many things at the ABC, it's staff collective and a closed shop, and any scrutiny is dealt with scorn.
Just following up on this, we noticed that there was the appointment of Ida Buttrose to the chair of the ABC. Were you thinking that when she was appointed as chair that there would be differences in the way that criticism was handled towards the ABC?
You'd think so. She came in with a lot of fanfare. She's often described in the media as a political conservative, but as we've seen with many people that have been appointed to the ABC with fanfare, they get swallowed up by the ABC. They get worked on, and then they become a voice for the ABC. We've appointed lots of conservatives over the years, some on its current board, seemingly with the view to fix the ABC, that ended up being mouthpieces for the ABC. And I think that's really disappointing. Ida Buttrose came in at the start and said, we do need more diversity at the ABC in terms of who we're putting on air. And that's a good point, because the amount of conservatives compared to progressives is scarce. And that's a good point to make. And then she was asked about this on an ABC program a couple of months later, and she said, well, by diversity actually meant ethnic diversity and diversity of our multicultural communities. And she famously said, she certainly wouldn't be inviting someone like Andrew Bolton to host a program or on its panels. We don't mean that kind of diversity. And to not mean that kind of diversity is really sneering at the Australian people, because mainstream Australians do not get a voice on the ABC. They believe in every single type of diversity at the ABC except for diversity of viewpoints. And when conservatives are invited on to an ABC panel, they'll usually get sat next to a left-wing comedian or be on a panel with 3 or 4 other left-wing guests from various different groups. And that's really not good enough. You're really saying to half of Australia that your views and your values are not worthy of being aired on the ABC, and that's just quite the outrage. It is an outrage, and I think more people are opening up to the fact that the ABC is a staff-run collective, and it can't be reformed.
We know that the ABC is funded by the taxpayer dollar. How much taxpayers' dollars actually contribute to the ABC?
So it's about 1.2 million. There's certain grants it gets on top of that as well for local content and news distribution services too, and by the way of Spectrum as well. So it's quite a lot of taxpayer money per year. We also saw an extraordinary example of the coalition folding to the ABC. Originally, the ABC wasn't going to be included into this mandatory media code where the news media services will be getting money off Google and Facebook for content, for supposedly stealing ad revenue. Now, last time I checked, the ABC doesn't have any ad revenue. It doesn't put out ads for commercials on its products. So the reason for the ABC being included in that is still, it doesn't make sense. But the coalition, in order to get it through the Senate, folded and allowed the ABC to be included in that. So it's doing $1 million deals with Facebook and Google and getting extra money that way. And that was a pathway allowed for by the Morrison government. So it's not only getting money from the taxpayer, The ABC is teaming up with big tech, and that is certainly the worst of both worlds. The ABC and big tech teaming up. I don't think that'll be good for mainstream Australians at all. So I think when you look at the amount of taxpayer money that goes to the ABC, a lot of people say, "Oh, it's a valued institution, and it's a great national institution that is at our service and services taxpayers." But it's more important, I think, to view the ABC as a public policy program, just like any other public policy program, whether it be putting money into bridges, putting money into hospitals and schools. We should view the ABC as a year-on-year public policy program and review that public policy program. Do we think we're getting value for money? There hasn't been a broad review into public broadcasting since the 1980s, which was the Dix inquiry, and something that many senators are now calling for, now that the ABC have scrapped a small inquiry into their complaints, is to have a broad inquiry into public broadcasting and whether it is necessary today. Senators like James Macquarie are calling for this. Do we actually need Triple J, a youth broadcaster? Do we actually need the amount of TV channels the ABC has? Does it need to run a 24-hour news service? And most people would say no. And do we have to have two separate public broadcasters, being the ABC and the SBS? Can they just be one? Ideas like bringing an SBS model to the ABC might be also worthwhile, where you could have a semi-commercial broadcaster. That way it would be less reliant on the taxpayer. I think all these ideas need to be put out in the public domain, subscription service as well as full privatisation as well, so we can understand and then realise the benefits of what that might look like.
On the topic of the amount of channels and all that, do you think that the ABC should be focusing on programming that wouldn't otherwise be on commercial TV or radio, given that it is taxpayers' money that's going towards this?
Exactly, and to see where the ABC has got to, you really have to look at why the ABC was started in the first place. It was started as a market failure broadcaster. There were many attempts to try to sort of boost services to radio back in the 1930s and 1920s that dismally failed. So they came up with the idea of the ABC because there was a lot of people in the cultural elite of Australia that were looking quite fondly on the creation of the BBC and thought that might be a good idea for Australia. Originally, it was radio, and then it evolved into TV as well. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is the evolution into the digital space as well. And so what was a market failure broadcaster is now a media monolith. It's a behemoth. It strays into every portion of the media market with taxpayers' dollars. Why on earth would we have this ABC Life website, which is now ABC Everyday? We've got the media market is flooded with websites like this that target the youth, that target clickbait. Why would we need to do that? Why is the ABC in podcast, for example? And I think there's a big issue around competitive neutrality, which I discuss in my podcast, Their ABC, because the ABC actually competes with taxpayer dollars against media rivals and actively tries to diminish the market share of its media rivals. One of the ways it does this is buy up Google AdWords and SEO searches on Google, so that the ABC is one of the first things you come up when you go searching for a certain topic in the news section on Google. Now, other media operators need that revenue and those clicks to pay their journalists. The ABC doesn't. The ABC gets a guaranteed $1.2 billion a year. Those other media sites like Nine and like News Corp and others rely on that to pay their journalists. And they do things like you would have seen billboard advertising all over Australia this past year. And IPA, FOI, Freedom of Information Request, found that they're spending record amounts on advertising during the COVID pandemic. At a time where media revenue was falling through the floor, they're out there trying to actively, in a sense, diminish the market share of their private media rivals. So you've got to ask whether that is a market failure broadcaster, or whether that's a broadcaster aggressively trying to look for clicks and diminish its media rivals.
Furthering on with that point there, do you think the ABC then should be focusing still on areas where there is a market failure, in rural and regional areas where they hold ABC rule with Triple J, instead of just being this pop culture and news site, but actually back to being a radio station which promotes local Australian musicians and puts them on a live stage, which private radio stations wouldn't in the first place?
Yeah, and I think, I used to listen to Triple J quite a bit, and I think a lot of people would say the same. When it used to promote, good Aussie talents that wouldn't get to go anywhere else, and it's just become sort of a hive of wokeness. Triple J, its political slant is there for all to see, but it's a political slant that we pay for, and why we pay for it is a very good question. And I think the decline of Triple J really started with, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, they decided to change the date of their Hottest 100 from Australia Day to the following day or another day, and they haven't had it on Australia Day since. Now, it is a public broadcaster, and it's clearly taking a stance on a contentious public policy issue, where year after year, the majority of Australians show up in polling that they support Australia Day being on January 26th. And you've got, in a sense, an arm of the government, a taxpayer-funded broadcaster that takes a different view. And so what you're in a sense doing is dismissing the majority in the community that want to celebrate Australia Day on January 26th, that used to like the Hottest 100, now don't watch it anymore, now don't listen to it anymore. That is quite disappointing, because a lot of upcoming bands get promotion through Triple J, and there'll be a lot of people that, like myself, that are switched off from Triple J because it just doesn't cater to people with mainstream views. And I think on your point about the ABC, getting back to basics, just last week they cut more regional services in Victoria and some of New South Wales. It's not actually catering to market failure. I think a lot of people would have more respect for the ABC if it actually was a proper regional broadcaster. It continually cuts services in the regions, cuts news broadcasting of market days and things like that. We've seen them, dismiss issues of importance to regional Australia. Another issue I look at in my documentary podcast, Their ABC, is the way it has viewed regional Australia and the industries that regional Australians work in. Like the live cattle trade episode, which it was the 10-year anniversary recently. The ABC Four Corners episode took some of which was nefarious video footage from activist group Animals Australia, put it to air, and overnight the Gillard government banned the live cattle trade to Australia. It sent hundreds of Australian farmers against the wall. It just caused huge economic impact in regional Australia. It damaged the relationship with one of our closest neighbours, and the ABC never covered the downsides of what happened. And we've seen other examples with the Adani mine as well, where they were completely on the wrong side of it. They followed the Bob Brown convoy as a media pack, essentially up through the Bowen Basin, only to be met with hostility. So I think we're seeing countless examples of this. And one thing, I spoke to Bridget McKenzie for my podcast, who's the Regional Communications Minister. She's certainly pushing for change in that regard. The ABC have a hiring process as well, where they're not hiring people from regional Australia for the rural bureaus. They are, in a sense, hiring people out of inner city universities, putting them into Ultimo or South Bank for a little while, and then indoctrinating them there, and then sending them out to regional communities. So in a sense, some of the main reporters there are from the outside reporting on, rather than from the inside reporting to the community. And that's the kind of way the ABC gets to control the narrative of what gets put to regional Australia. And I think that's to the detriment of regional Australia.
Going back, sort of relating to mainstream voices, I remember when the IPA did a poll about wagering support for Australia Day, And when you look at that compared to the ABC's Australia Talks survey, there was a big difference in the percentage of support. There's a much lower level of support from the ABC survey. Do you think there's perhaps a purposeful attempt to convince viewers of the ABC that, you know, mainstream Australians don't agree with them?
Yeah, well, you're right. The RPA has been polling attitudes on Australia Day for 5 years now, and in every single poll, it's come up between 69 and 75% support for Australia Day, and those who want to change the date between 10 and 11%. Now, we asked a pretty neutral question. Australia Day should be celebrated on January 26th, and we asked people to agree or disagree with that proposition, and consistently show support. The ABC, and if you look at their Australia Talks questions, use very loaded language in the way they ask a question to completely invite an answer. For example, the ABC Australia Day question, they asked, Australia Day should not be celebrated on January 26th, given the historical significance of the date for Indigenous people. Now, that is, in a sense, inviting an answer. It's putting a proposition and then inviting an answer. It's not neutrally asking a question and letting people's preconceived ideas come through in that question. So we've also polled people's attitudes towards Australia in general. You've got something like 82% of people are proud to be Australian. 75% people are proud of our history and our past. And those things you never see from the ABC. You never see patriotism and nationalism from a public broadcaster. It's always wallowing about colonisation and really sort of the dark patches of our past, this black band view of history that comes through our national curriculums and our universities and everything else. And yeah, that Australia Talk survey, and you see it through their coverage as well. They had a massive scandal earlier in the year where they decided that Australia Day and Invasion Day are terms that could be used interchangeably. And immediately after they issued that guide and put a news story up about it, the previous presenters were on air but calling Australia Day Invasion Day. And they were promoting protests around the country that weren't actually following COVID rules either. So within 24 hours, they were forced to back down because there was such community anger about it. And these are the kind of things that really gets up people's noses. This is a taxpayer-funded institution that is, in a sense, deciding whether Australia Day should be celebrated, and we should celebrate being Australian. And your average mainstream Australian out there will say, "Of course, Australia, we should celebrate being Australia. We're in the best country in the world," and it's only people at Ultimo and South Bank really that disagree with that proposition.
I mean, I'm living in Pyrmont, but I do disagree with that proposition there. So we'll take that point there. But we have a question coming in from the audience. How is the ABC regulated, and is there any consequence for showing political bias?
Well, that's the unfortunate thing. It's regulated as an independent statutory body. I mean, the government can change the ABC Act if it wanted to, but it can't actually force board decisions. It can force board appointments when board members expire their terms, but that's about it. Political bias is meant to be managed by the board, and they're usually they're not very transparent about that. And there was one example of that being the Blackburn Review. They got well-credentialed BBC journalist Kerry Blackburn to review their election coverage of the 2019 election to see whether the ABC was impartial in its putting forward and presenting of each major party. And the review had actually reported back to the ABC and the ABC board. We don't know what happened with it, whether any changes were implemented at the ABC. I highly doubt it. But this was asked for in Senate estimates. The ABC declined to release it. It was asked for in a number of other committees in the Electoral Matters Committee, and they declined it. And then it was only through what James McGrath forcing the release of the documents through a vote in the Senate, which the ABC, with Labor and the Greens obviously voted against, that a Senate order was made to release it. And surprise, surprise, that review found that the ABC was biased to Labor and even biased to the Greens. So we've got a clear case where you've got political bias. The board knows there's political bias. The board's meant to act on that political bias. We don't know whether that they've acted on it. They're not public about that. But even when there is political bias, they're not honest about it. They're not transparent about it enough to be able to release that to the public. Even though we pay for it, we pay for that report, we pay for the board positions, we pay for the management, the editorial, everything we pay for. Yet we, the taxpayer, don't get to see what's going on about political bias. And I kind of think it's a good question because there should be much more accountability with the public broadcaster. And they go out and say, oh, we're the most accountable broadcaster because we have to front Senate estimates. But at the end of the day, there's no accountability from the Parliament. Even when the Parliament tries to make the ABC accountable through a small Senate inquiry, they go up in arms. So I guess getting it out of, if the ABC wants to be independent and wants its independence, we should take that to the next level and make them truly independent, which is independent from taxpayer dollars. Because then I will defend their freedom of speech and editorial stance every day of the week, because there'd be a private media organisation operating in the private media market. And that's kind of what we need to get to. If they want to be a broadcaster that just shuns at transparency, then why are they still funded by us?
We've got another audience question coming through. We've actually got two. The first one is is it possible to reform the ABC? And then the second one along the same lines is, can the ABC be reformed to represent the majority of the population instead of only the fringe minorities?
Yeah, I'll take your second question first, because Michael Kroger's been pushing for this for a while to amend the ABC Act. Currently, the ABC Charter obliges the ABC to do a few things. It obliges it to represent the cultural diversity of Australia. Now, the ABC takes that to mean lots of other things that it doesn't. But that's sort of very broad, loose term. Michael Kroger wants to add in, as suggested in Chris Mitchell's column this past week, to add in things like the ABC should report on the coverage of the small business community, the coverage of the Australian economy, coverage of Australia and the celebration of what it is to be Australian, to try to make the ABC and steer its reporting towards a more mainstream viewpoint, towards regional Australia as well. Whether that kind of idea would have any weight, I don't know. The board doesn't really do a good job in keeping the ABC to its charter anyway. So I have my scepticism about whether that would work. Maybe it would work slightly, but I still think you'd see bias in the reporting of that. They'd go out and report on those kind of issues, but put it in a slant that they want to put it on. I don't think the ABC can be reformed. I think it's completely beyond redemption. And you've got to kind of look at why that is and look at how the ABC is structured. It has over 4,000 staff, half of which are based at the Ultimo studios in Sydney. And as with all public sector workforces, the ABC is a highly unionised workforce. It's got very high rates of union memberships. The staff are very left-wing. Sinclair Davidson and Chris Berg, for their book in Public Broadcasting, did some analysis based on a journalism survey, which found that 45% of ABC staff vote for the Greens, not even Labor. And to get up the ranks in the ABC, you really have to be a particular slant of person. You have to have a particular view about the world. And if you're a mainstream Australian or a political conservative or libertarian at the ABC, there's just no way you'd be promoted. And I've had several staff members that have left the ABC that have chatted to me since and would absolutely relay that kind of view. So the ABC is always going to be a staff collective. And no matter how many times we try to reform it, we've put Morris Newman on the board. We had a managing director that was in there a while ago, Jonathan Shear, You've had people like Michael Kroger, Janet Albrechtsen, Judith Sloan, others on the board, and nothing much seems to change. So there's a few suggestions that I go into in my podcast, and I do recommend all your viewers go out and listen to my podcast, Their ABC, available on the IPA website and all podcast platforms. Because we actually look at this idea, whether it can be reformed by a few different things, and we delve into the idea of, would the ABC could it be fixed by moving its location? And this is one thing I spoke to Tony Abbott about on the podcast, and he's actually very much in favour of moving it out, moving Ultimo to somewhere like the Central Coast and moving the South Bank studio to somewhere like Geelong, because at least then the ABC staff would have to intermingle with people out there, mainstream punters out there in the community that aren't of an inner city bent. I actually think that if the government were to do something, that's probably the most palpable option. I mean, Labor's public broadcasting policy released last week, they just announced that they were going to move the SBS to Western Sydney so it can be with all the multicultural communities, right? Why wouldn't the coalition go, well, Labor's doing that policy, we're going to move the ABC, because they've got cover to do it. And I actually think the Western Sydney Aerotropolis, this new business hub they're building around Western Sydney Airport, that would be a perfect place to put it. The ABC staff would hate that. They would hate that, and a lot of them would quit. And it would give people that want to see ABC reform the ability to see it and for the ABC to start afresh. And it might work. I still think you're going to have the same underlying issues. And similar things have happened at the BBC where they moved it out to a more working class area. And you saw it gentrify very quickly into basically a hipster town. And I think a similar thing would happen if you tried to move the ABC. The ABC mentioned it was going to move 300 staff to Parramatta. None of its main presenters are moving there. Basically all back office people, not many editorial people. So I don't think you'll see the particular editorial bent change through that decision. And it's beyond redemption. Looking at the coverage like we've seen in major programs like Q&A, like Four Corners, like The Drum, it's not going to change its spots. It's never going to try to represent a mainstream viewpoint because in their eyes and the staff's eyes, their viewpoint of the world is the most divine, protected point of view, and everyone else must be wrong. And that's kind of how they get big monumental events wrong, like the 2019 election. So I think it is beyond redemption, and it's high time we start talking about, and that's kind of the purpose of my podcast, is we start talking about and having a discussion about, should the ABC become a subscription service? The ABC has something like 15% of the market share for TV. That would do quite, if those 15% willing to pay a bit for the ABC, that would do quite well as a streaming service, where people could subscribe naturally to the ABC. And I think there's lots of privatisation models that we could look at. For example, people rightly say the ABC is quite needed in regional Australia, particularly radio, for emergency broadcasting, things like that. When Telstra was privatised by the Howard government set regional service obligations on the privatised company in order for them to service areas that wouldn't be serviced by the market. You could do exactly the same thing with the ABC. You could set regional obligations on a privatised ABC, or you could offer up a tender as the government for emergency broadcasting. And so I'm sure Channel 10, Channel 7, Channel 9 would love that. They would love to get their hands on some money to do some emergency service broadcasting and things like that. So people see privatisation or turning the ABC into a subscription service in something that will never happen. It can never be done. But I think it's an important discussion to have. It's an important discussion to push the boat out on what's possible for ABC reform, because it is beyond redemption. And most people, I think, on the right are coming to the view that the ABC is beyond redemption. It's just what we do about it is the next question that needs to be answered.
So we've got two sort of related questions next. So in the podcast, Their ABC, you say that most people in the centre-right of politics have appeared in ABC programs, but have since ridiculed the broadcaster and never reappeared. So both, why do you think that is? And then an audience question being, with the head of the IPA, John Roscombe, appearing in the next Q&A, what do you expect from his appearance since there's been barely any people on the centre right lately?
Yeah, true. I think a lot of Conservatives have a lot of issues going on the ABC because they treat Conservatives as a token, as some sort of weird outsider that it's good to get on to counter their point of view. And even when they do let Conservatives on, as many people in the podcast, like Janet Albrechtson discussed, they'll get them on as a token. They'll get them on to mock, to scorn at, and often, in shows like Q&A, they'll place the Conservatives next to a left-wing comedian or celebrity or musician to get laughed at, to scorn at, to make a snarky comment that gets the clap from the audience for a gotcha moment. And I think Conservatives have had just about enough of that kind of scorn at legitimate values at taxpayer expense. The ABC's Drum Panel Show hasn't had someone from the IPA on its program for over 1,000 days. The IPA used to appear quite regularly. People in the past, like Tim Wilson, James Patterson, and Chris Berg, used to appear regularly, but do not get a go on the ABC these days because the ABC have continually shifted to what is an acceptable centre-right person, and they're more likely to get very moderate, small L liberals on that might agree with them on climate change and other issues like that, and they're continually narrowing what is acceptable right and centre viewpoints, and that kind of thing is not acceptable because I think we saw with the 2019 election, we've seen with issues like religious freedom and other things that these people's views actually matter. They shape elections, they change elections, and you can't just dismiss one segment of the community because you don't have to disagree. You don't have to agree with them. And if they're going to have shows like panel shows, they should be open to debate. They should be open to arguments being put, and that's something the ABC does not do. And I think to John's appearance, my description of Q&A in their ABC podcast came true because there's a comedian, a musician, Mixie Higgins, who's been involved in all sorts of left-wing activism like anti-Adani protests and things like that. And then you've got a couple of other left-wingers and just one Conservative in John. So the ABC continuously does this. And John's very good on his feet on shows like that. So I highly recommend you tune in, get involved on Twitter. But it's just classic ABC, isn't it? This is their stock and trade. This is what they do. And it's exactly a good example of why the ABC needs to be reformed or done away with.
Just actually on that point, our next question: here at the Macquarie University Liberal Club, we once held an event on this exact issue with Tom Switzer, who was not only the head of the Centre for Independent Studies, but was also a host of ABC's Radio National. Switzer suggested that it doesn't actually have to be abolished. It needs to be reformed to survive. Do you agree with this?
Not necessarily, and I'm a big fan of Tom Switzer. He does great work at the CIS, and I do enjoy his show. But his is a very small show, and there's no prominent Conservative host, presenter, or producer on any of its main television programs. They're filled with left-wing guests. I actually don't think it can be reformed. As I said earlier, we've tried. Jonathan Cheer got forced out of the managing director role. Anyone that tries to implement slight change of the ABC gets hounded out by their staff collective because the staff collective is so strong, so unionised, so protected. It's a protected beast that they'll force anyone out who tries to change the ABC. I don't think it can be reformed. It will be a brave person that tries to reform it. But I think we've got to look at the options on the table. The world is changing. The world of the media is changing with technology. And we really need a proper review so that we can have the discussion, have the debate, and ask ourselves, in 2021, do we really need a public broadcaster? And I'll put it to you this. Imagine if someone came out today and said, we need to start up a new, with all the media we have in abundance at the moment. Within your phone, you can access hundreds of news outlets. Imagine if someone came out today and said, "We need a new public broadcaster. We need our taxpayer money spent on a brand new public broadcaster, and we're going to spend $1 billion on it a year." Everyone would think that is just an insane idea, but it kind of, people are scared off any sort of reform or attempt to, because we've always had the ABC. That seems to be the view. But as I said, we need to view it as a public policy program that we keep spending $1.2 billion a year on, and move past what the ABC once was, because we know you can never go back to what the ABC was, because it's now beyond redemption and beyond reform.
The one thing that many people across the political spectrum agree on is that the ABC does well with their regional and rural news coverage. Would limiting their services have a negative impact on rural areas?
I don't necessarily think so, and I do agree with that sentiment. A lot of people will say the further you get away from Ultimo or South Bank into the regions, the more balanced and centrist the ABC becomes, because a lot of the people in those newsrooms have to get out in their community. They have to be part of the community. So they're a lot more even-handed in their regional offering. But as I said earlier, if you were to reform the ABC into a subscription service, for example, you do it in the metro areas, and you might have a slimline, standalone regional broadcaster that would put out regional radio into communities that don't have much of a media market. I think that could be a good way of selling it. You would be boosting the amount of coverage in regional Australia, particularly on radio, while getting away from a lot of the activism and politics that goes on in the inner city. We shouldn't just accept that because it broadcasts into regional Australia, that we should continue having the ABC as the taxpayer-funded institution. I think there's lots of ideas that I do explore in the podcast. It's the third or fourth episode. It's called Their Inner City, where we look at the ABC's coverage in regional Australia and how it can be reformed to better reflect the views of regional Australia, because a lot of the time the views and news is being controlled out of Ultimo or Brisbane or South Bank. And I don't necessarily think that the Bundaberg studio or the Townsville studios should be dictated to by Brisbane, because it's a completely different market. But this is the kind of thing that happens at the ABC. So I don't think regional Australia is being well served by the ABC. It sneers on regional industries and the places in which regional Australians work, and it doesn't provide a worldview that matches those of regional Australia as well, which is why a lot of people are actually turning to Sky News in the regions, because Sky News now offers free-to-air news. And a lot of people I speak to in the regions will say, thank God we have Sky News now, because the ABC is all we've got, and it was just a woke hive of rubbish every night beamed into our TV sets. And now that we've got Sky News, it's great. Actually get a sensible presentation of news. So I think with more broadcasters moving that way into regional Australia, the role of the ABC is really being undercut, and its relevance is really declining in regional Australia. So I don't think we should use it as an excuse not to reform and have a go at reforming the ABC. I think there are a lot of options done, as I said earlier. Regional service obligations. You could put on a privatised ABC to broadcast into the regions.
You do make a good point there about how the ABC in regional areas is becoming a lot different. During the Upper Hunter by-elections, we saw that the ABC was one of the major broadcasters commenting about the fact that Malcolm Turnbull was donating to the independent candidate during the Upper Hunter campaign, while no other broadcaster was doing so. But touching over to something which you've already commented on already in terms of the subscriptions, Sinclair in the UK, the Tories have recommended that the BBC, given its large cultural status, as we've touched on, should have a subscription for anyone willing to pay for it. Can that work for the ABC?
I think it can. And in my podcast, in the last episode, I look into the idea of a subscription service. And I actually speak to a fellow by the name of Professor Philip Booth from the Institute of Economic Affairs, similar to the RPA. He's also a lecturer at a bunch of universities over there, like the University of Buckingham. But he's written a report and studied the BBC and looked at it becoming a subscription service and how you do it. And they want to turn it into like a subscriber mutual model, where you would subscribe to the BBC, and then people who did subscribe to the BBC would get a say into its operations and how it operates and works. So I think that's quite a good idea. It's different there because they pay for the ABC for a license fee, which is separate from their tax, so they notice it more. So turning the BBC into a subscription service actually is a bit popular because a lot of people don't watch it, but because they have a TV set, they get charged for the BBC, and they'll check if you're watching the BBC. Whereas in the ABC, it's just collected out of general revenue. So the smart thing for the government to do would be to actually highlight how much tax you pay for the ABC per year. I think it's about $100 or something. And one of the things that Rowan Dean suggested is that you could sell a subscription service to the ABC by saying we're going to cut the tax by $100 a year, and we're turning the ABC into a subscription service in order to do that. And if you want to keep subscribing to the ABC, you can keep doing that, and you can pay for it this way, or you can keep paying your tax. You can make it a taxpayer subscription service, but I think the better option is to one that Sinclair Davidson kind of suggested. You give the ABC to its staff and let them decide whether they want to go down the subscription model or privatisation model or investment model. You would give it away to the staff because currently it costs us over $1 billion a year. So you give it to its staff, you give them a bit of money to boot, and let them do what they want with it. They're probably best placed to run the ABC or whatever comes after the ABC. But I think a subscription service is a good idea. We've got a flurry of them in Australia. If the ABC wants to be a green left broadcaster that views everything through the warped prism of identity politics and engages in green left activism, it can do that. But people who want to view the ABC through that prism can happily subscribe to the ABC. I certainly wouldn't.
So you mentioned Sinclair Davidson, and with privatisation that have been giving the ABC back to the people. So who would be in the best people to run it if that scenario happened?
I think it's current staff. The ABC is a staff-run collective, so why not leave it to its current staff? You would say to the ABC staff to basically give it away to them, and then whatever they do with the ABC would be collected back through fringe benefits tax, and the taxpayer would make money off it. The staff would get to own and run the ABC, and it would be freed from taxpayer reliance. If the ABC truly wants to be independent, it can be, and it can be independent off our money. And so I think a model like that, which is explained to in his book with more detail than I'm giving now, is better. And he does explain it on the podcast as well when we run through those privatisation options. So I think that would be a good idea. I don't think quite floating the ABC on the stock market or something would work straight away. So you would let the staff run it, you would give it to the staff, and then let them decide what to do with it. I think quite quickly they'll find they can no longer afford to stay in Ultima or South Bank either.
Another suggestion of reform is merging the ABC with the far more successful and far more less controversial SBS. Since SBS is more left-wing than the ABC, do you think it will reduce the politicalisation of public broadcasting?
Yeah, I think that's a good model worth pursuing. There's a few senators that suggest that model, that you would merge the ABC with the SBS and then make the merged broadcaster a a semi-commercial broadcaster like the SBS. It would certainly save taxpayer dollars. You could reduce the amount of money given to the merged ABC SBS by the amount of commercial revenue they get back. And I guess with the focus on ratings, they would have to focus on ratings and how much the advertisers spend. So in a sense, the ABC would have to become more appealing to its viewers. And that's not what we're getting at the moment. Look at Q&A. It's got more green left, and it used to rate 10 years ago. It used to get almost 1 million viewers. Now it gets like 200,000 to 300,000 viewers. And so I think the ABC would have to, go back to the drawing board, I guess, and look at what rates, look at what appeals to mainstream Australians, not what appeals to a narrow green left viewpoint.
I've just got a question coming through within the audience there, and essentially the way that people have perceived for the ABC is that the comments that it's become politically biased has been since the coalition have been in government. Do you think there's a possibility that we could potentially see a switch in those opinions if Labor was to get into government federally?
No, I think, respectfully, the ABC is almost emboldened now. The coalition of government have been in 8 years, in for 8 years, and barely touched the sides as far as ABC reform. So they now know they can basically get away with anything, and not have to deal with the political consequences of that. And if Labor get in at the next election, I think you'll find there might be some scrutiny of Labor, but similar to the Rudd and Gillard years, the criticism always comes from a green left perspective. It never comes from the right. You won't see during. I was very politically involved at uni during the Rudd and Gillard years, and you never saw the ABC criticise them from the right. It was always from the left. It was always on same-sex marriage. It was always on refugees or New Start or social justice issues. It was never on the carbon tax. They were always on the government side there, and on their side on the climate change issue and lots of other issues like that. They were never arguing against the mining tax. In fact, they were rather supportive of it. So I think you can see. Labor governments do get frustrated with the ABC, but they only get frustrated with the ABC because they're always attacking them from the green left perspective. But more often than not, they'll love the ABC, and why they're so vocal about the ABC, Labor and the Greens. And you've got to ask, it's completely transparent, right? The people most vocal about any attacks on the ABC are Get Up, Labor, the Greens, the Australia Institute, Friends of the ABC, all massively left-wing outfits. And you've got to ask why that is. And we know why it is, because the ABC presents a worldview that is most similar to theirs. But it's with our money, and that's not good enough.
What do you think that the biggest low point that the ABC has ever faced?
That's a good question. I think there's lots of them. I think one of the main ones was fronting up a convicted criminal and terrorist sympathiser to berate Steve Chobo back in, I think it was 2014. That was a particular low point. But there's lots of others. There's the live cattle trade issue. Their outrageous story on Alan Tudge and Christian Porter was a complete low point. And also the persecution by the ABC of Cardinal George Pell, which was wiped off the floor of the High Court 7-0. A complete embarrassment. If that happened to any private media organisation, you wouldn't have someone like Louise Milligan still working for them, let alone continuing to do stories like the Canberra bubble, like all the other stories that she's gone on to do. And stories like that QAnon story they tried to make out of a friend of the Prime Minister's wife or something. Like, how low can you go? And we're continually seeing stories like that. We saw that their racism documentary recently where they went into schools and taught schools about white privilege and made people made kids as young as 8 confront their own privileges based on weird, critical race theory ideas. So I think we see the ABC engage in new lows year after year.
Just to finish up, I mean, you made some good comments there about Zaki Mali going on, and the one that always pops to my mind is Yasmin Abdel Magid with her comments about Anzac Day. But just to finish up, where do you see the role that the ABC plays with the upcoming federal election?
I think quite similar to the last election. And Mark Latham put it well on the podcast where he said, they were almost a campaigning unit for Labor. Have a look at, and I do watch them, have a look at Laura Tingle's political broadcasts on the 7:30 report every night. And they are so slanted and so biased that it is beyond redemption. And this is someone that went onto Twitter, I think earlier this year or late last year, and accused the Prime Minister of ideological bastardry and has called him on occasions on Insiders a goose and all sorts of names. Do you really think that your chief political reporter on your major current affairs news program, is able to cover the election impartially when she thinks that of our Prime Minister? No, of course not. So Scott Morrison is up against it. He's up against the Labor, he's up against the Greens, and he's also up against the ABC. And considering how biased the ABC was last time, and it's not just me saying they're biased, their own review said they were biased. Why wouldn't you have tried to do something about it to stem the bias at the ABC? So if Scott Morrison is returned, he's more than not likely to be returned with a friendlier Senate. And that is when the coalition should take a serious look at the ABC and actually look at reforming biased public broadcaster.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Evan. We really appreciate for all your insight and the discussion that you've given us. And for those who have been watching in the audience, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll be back next week for our final episode of the Sunday sessions for this year. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.